I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. Welcome to this podcast of the People's Pharmacy.
You can find previous podcasts and more information on a range of health topics at peoplespharmacy.com.
Should you be taking a statin to control your cholesterol? Official guidelines have changed. Will that change your doctor's prescription? This is the People's Pharmacy with Terry and Joe Graydon.
Dr. Steve Nissen is one of the country's leading cardiologists and a critic of the previous guidelines. The risk calculator would have put almost all older people on a statin. Dr. Nissen explains how that's changed.
Have you ever taken a drug like atorvastatin, rosuvastatin, or simvastatin? How well did it work? Did you have any side effects? Have you found other ways to lower your cholesterol and improve your heart health?
Coming up on the People's Pharmacy, new guidelines and your stories about how you control your cholesterol.
First, this news.
In the People's Pharmacy health headlines, the Food and Drug Administration has issued another drug recall because of contamination with a probable carcinogen. This time, it's for the combination pill containing amlodipine and valsartan, prescribed for hypertension and heart failure. The company is Aurobindo Pharma USA, a division of Aurobindo Pharma Limited of India. This recall falls on the heels of another recent recall for a related blood pressure pill called losartan. The recalled losartan was made by Torrent using an active pharmaceutical ingredient made by Hetero Labs Limited. Both companies are based in India. There have been numerous recalls of related medications starting in July of 2018. The problem is that the manufacturing process for the active pharmaceutical ingredients of losartan, valsartan, and irbesartan appears to result in contamination with N-nitrosodiethylamine and N-nitrosodimethylamine. Aurobindo is recalling 80 lots of this combination medication. That's a lot of lots. If you take amlodipine and valsartan, check with your pharmacist to see whether your pills are being recalled and could be replaced. Don't stop taking blood pressure medicine without consulting your healthcare provider.
Usually, people are advised to drink plenty of liquids to keep their kidneys functioning well. A new study suggests, however, that those liquids should not be sweetened with sugar. The Jackson Heart Study included 3,003 African American adults with normal kidney function at the beginning of the study. After approximately 8 years, about 6% of these people had developed kidney disease. Questionnaires they filled out when the study began showed that those who consumed the most sugar-sweetened beverages, including sweetened fruit drinks, were 61% more likely to be diagnosed with kidney disease than those who drank the least sweetened drinks.
Some people respond to the news that sugar-sweetened beverages pose health hazards by switching to diet soft drinks. A new analysis in the BMJ suggests that might not be the best strategy. The researchers reviewed 56 studies of non-sugar sweeteners and found, quote, no compelling evidence to indicate important health benefits. In most of these studies, comparing outcomes for people consuming artificial sweeteners to those for people consuming none, there were no significant differences. In a few small studies, people using sugar substitutes had lower fasting blood sugar and slightly better body mass index, but these findings were statistically uncertain. The researchers point out that these studies did not adequately address questions of safety. They call for longer-term, better-designed trials to establish clearer conclusions on safety and effectiveness of sugar substitutes.
As people age, their balance and coordination may become compromised. Some older people may cut back on exercise for fear that such physical activity could raise their risk for falls. A large meta-analysis published in JAMA Internal Medicine should eliminate those concerns. Researchers reviewed the results of 40 studies involving more than 21,000 participants. They found that long-term exercise programs, especially those involving multi-component training like aerobic workouts plus strength and balance training, actually reduced the likelihood of falls. There was a non-significant trend towards fewer fractures. These findings bolster the efforts of the American College of Sports Medicine to recognize that exercise is medicine and have doctors prescribe it. In an accompanying editorial, doctors are urged to prescribe exercise 3 times a week, 50 minutes per session, for their patients 65 and older.
The law of unintended consequences has struck again. The hospital readmissions reduction program was supposed to cut readmissions for heart failure, heart attacks, and pneumonia. Hospitals are penalized financially if their readmission rates are too high. The program did indeed result in fewer readmissions, but research published in JAMA suggests that this policy has actually resulted in increased mortality for people with heart failure and pneumonia. Perhaps the financial penalties made doctors reluctant to readmit some patients in trouble. And that's the health news from the People's Pharmacy this week. Welcome to the People's Pharmacy. I'm Joe Graydon. I'm a pharmacologist.
And I'm Terry Graydon. I'm a medical anthropologist. What should you do to prevent heart disease? Earlier last year, the American Heart Association and the American College of Cardiology issued new guidelines. Some of the recommendations are familiar, but there are changes from the last standards that came out 5 years ago.
To learn about the new guidelines and what they might mean for you, we turn to Dr. Steve Nissen. He's chairman of the Robert and Suzanne Tomsich Department of Cardiovascular Medicine at the Cleveland Clinic. His book, co-written with Dr. Mark Gilinoff, is Heart 411.
Welcome back to the People's Pharmacy, Dr. Steve Nissen.
It's always good to be with you.
Dr. Nissen, 2013, there was this furor over guidelines, when to start statins. And the American College of Cardiology, the American Heart Association came out and basically said every man over the age of 65 needs to be on a statin. Doesn't matter if you're vegetarian, run 10 miles a day, are underweight, and in perfect health. Otherwise, if you're 65, you need to be on a statin. And I think for women, it was around age 70. And we talked to you and you said, I'm not thrilled with this risk calculator stuff and these new guidelines, but they stayed in place until just recently. Tell us about the history and the new guidelines and your role in all of this.
Well, I was very critical of the 2013 guidelines, as were a number of other people. I didn't think the process was particularly good by which they were generated. I think they've done better with the latest set of guidelines. And it raises some important principles that are really important for us to talk about. First of all, a guideline is not a mandate. It's a guidance. It's a guideline about what to do. And it's important that everybody, the public, understand that just because you cross a certain threshold in somebody's calculator doesn't mean that a particular therapy is right for you. The concept that I think most thoughtful physicians engage in is one of shared decision-making, where you sit down with a patient, you tell them what the guideline says, you talk to them about other factors that may influence their personal decision about whether to have a therapy or not. I think they've done a bit better job with the latest set of guidelines in helping people to understand that. If you read them carefully, for example, they say that the risk calculator works for populations, but not necessarily for individuals. That was a tough admission for the guideline writers to make, but it's right. That on any individual patient, as you just pointed out a minute ago, your lifestyle, your family history, other factors may need to be taken into account in deciding whether or not you ought to be treated or not. And they've actually introduced in the guidelines the idea that you ought to look at those other factors. Some of the other factors I agree with. There's at least one of them that I disagree with that we can talk about. But by and large, the idea that people participate in a discussion with their physicians based upon the background of the guidelines and make an individual decision, that's the right thing to do.
Well, Dr. Nissen, as you are aware, we are very much in favor of people participating in this decision. Can you tell us a little bit about the guidelines so that people will have some understanding of them?
And which ones you agree with and which ones you disagree with?
Well, fundamentally, probably we have somewhat similar views. I tend to be an advocate for statins primarily because in people at high risk, we do have really strong data to suggest that we can reduce risk in individuals that are at very high risk. The question is, how do we determine that they're at very high risk? So the guidelines use something it's got a long name, the pool cohort equations, which is proposed as a better way to assess risk by putting in various factors such as age and gender and ethnicity and cholesterol levels and blood pressure and smoking history and so on. And then they add in these other risk factors like family history, the presence of inflammation as measured by C-reactive protein. And so I think that these new guidelines do have a more nuanced approach. There are some good things about the guidelines, some improvements. They're not perfect, but they do address, for example, younger people, and they address older people. The old guidelines didn't speak to what to do with people over the age of 75. And as I get older and as I approach the age of 75, I begin to think about the fact that people's life isn't over when they hit 75 years of age. And so the idea that in appropriate patients over the age of 75, treatment can be considered. Doesn't mean it should be administered, but it can be considered, is a thoughtful way to go. I think the principle that people need to understand is that the higher your risk, the more likely you are to have a net benefit from taking a statin drug. If you're at particularly low risk, younger women, people that don't have a family history, etc., then you want to have a more cautious attitude about whether to treat or not. There is one more big change that I do agree with, and we're talking really now about very high-risk individuals. These are people that have, maybe they've had a heart attack, maybe they've had bypass surgery, they've got stents in their coronaries, and their LDL cholesterol, the bad cholesterol, is still high. What the guidelines say is if you're above 70 milligrams per deciliter for LDL or bad cholesterol, that you can be considered for adding on additional treatments. And I do think for these very high-risk individuals, that's a suitable, approach to managing risk. Now, that's not everybody. That's a minority of the population that's at very high risk. But those very high-risk people do need aggressive treatment, and I'm glad the guidelines address it.
Now, Dr. Nissen, when we talked to you a couple of years ago, you emphasized the importance of healthy living, lifestyle modification, and prevention. I assume that you're very pleased that the new guidelines emphasize those very things. But the challenge, of course, is how to make them part of your life, how to implement them, and especially how to get health professionals involved in what I'll call a coaching process. So that it's not just, hey, Charlie, lose weight, stop smoking, and exercise more, because that wagging of the finger and tone of voice often don't work.
You're absolutely right. They don't work. And, we really need to come up with better systems as a society. We are losing the battle. The obesity epidemic is continuing out of control. We really have not seen a leveling off of the problem. Our diets are terrible. That 50% of the American population lives within 2 miles of an infamous fast food chain. I'm sure everybody knows what I'm talking about. And many Americans, that's their diet, is fast food, burgers, fries, fried chicken. And we have to address these issues. the lack of exercise. We published a paper recently showing an incredible relationship between fitness and longevity. And it's just extraordinary that the more fit you are, the more you exercise, the longer you live, the better your brain works. But we don't have systems in place to make this easy. We're losing the battle in the schools. Physical education of our young people is actually being abandoned by a lot of schools. So I'm troubled by the fact that, statins are effective drugs, but even more effective is to have a societal program that makes healthy lifestyle reduce the need for medication. And as you point out rightly, we just haven't figured out how to do it.
Dr. Nissen, how should people and their doctors weigh the benefits and risks of statins to determine if that is an appropriate treatment for them?
Well, I think transparency is critical. And I can only tell you what I do is I tell people what the scientific literature shows. I often give my patients articles, that is the clinical trials, so they can see how they match up with the patients that were studied. I'm very open about the fact that a certain number of people will have adverse effects like muscle pain or, relatively rare side effects, but people can certainly have them. There is a little bit of an uptick in the risk of diabetes in people treated with statins, and we always disclose that. And not everybody wants to take medications, every day for the rest of their life. Once we've had a discussion of benefits and risks, we can then have a discussion about the patient's individual preferences. And, you have to show patients respect. You have to recognize that it's not your body that you're treating, it's theirs. And I find that it's pretty easy to come to a consensus with most patients. What doesn't work is a heavy-handed approach that says, look, I'm your doctor, I know what's best, just take this pill every day. In fact, there's amazing data about adherence to statin regimens. A lot of patients will take drugs for 3 months or 6 months and then just stop taking them. If you've reached a joint decision that it's the right thing to do, then patients are much more likely to stay on their medications. Please keep in mind that the clinical trials that showed large benefits, particularly in people that have had previous heart disease events, were 5-year trials. And so what you really want is to have an understanding that you've got to be in a position to take these drugs long term to get the benefits they offer.
You're listening to Dr. Steve Nissen, chairman of the Robert and Suzanne Tomsich Department of Cardiovascular Medicine at the Cleveland Clinic.
We invite you to join the conversation. How do you reduce your risk for a heart attack? Our lines are open for your calls and questions. The number 888-472-3366.
After the break, we'll talk about tests for diagnosing heart disease.
Again, that number if you'd like to join the conversation, 888-472-3366.
You're listening to The People's Pharmacy with Joe and Terry Graydon.
The People's Pharmacy podcast is sponsored in part by Kaya Biotics. KAYA Biotics offers the first probiotics which are both certified organic and hypoallergenic.
All probiotics are produced in Germany under laboratory conditions with high-quality ingredients and under strict regulatory oversight.
The 3 available formulas are created for very specific purposes, such as strengthening the immune system, fighting yeast infections, and helping with weight loss.
To learn more about Kaya Biotics probiotics and the important topic of gut health, you can visit their website, KayaBiotics.com. That's KAYA Biotics.com. Use the discount code PEOPLE for $10 off your first purchase.
Welcome back to the People's Pharmacy. I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. If you would like to purchase a CD of this show, you can call 800-732-2334. It's show number 1147. Or you can find it online at peoplespharmacy.com.
The People's Pharmacy is brought to you in part by Kaya Biotics, probiotic products made in Germany from certified organic ingredients. KAYABiotics.com.
Today we're exploring how to prevent heart disease. What are you doing to keep your heart healthy?
Doctors often prescribe a statin drug to lower cholesterol. Have you taken one? How well did it work for you? What else have you tried? Our lines are open at 888-472-3366. You can send us an email. We're at radio@peoplespharmacy.com. The number again, 888-472-3366.
We'll take your calls in just a couple minutes. First, we turn back to Dr. Steve Nissen. He's chairman of the Robert and Suzanne Tomsich Department of Cardiovascular Medicine at the Cleveland Clinic. His book is Heart 411.
Dr. Nissen, there's another test that has been done and is becoming more popular over the last couple of years. It's called a calcium score or a scan. Can you tell us what you think about it and how reliable it is for assessing risk?
So I am the most negative person on the planet about calcium scanning, and I'm going to tell you why I am. First of all, I don't think that radiating people in order to determine whether to treat them with a medication is a good idea. There is no safe dose of radiation. And we have a huge societal burden from these CT scans related to radiation. You can actually calculate the risks down the road. It's often 10 or 20 years later of malignancy from radiation exposure. Secondly, I just don't think it's a good idea. I see people every week that go in and get a calcium scan. In fact, there are some hospitals in America that offer it for free. Why do you think they offer a calcium scan for free? You know it costs them something to do it.
Well, my guess would be that it leads people to get treatment that's quite pricey.
What happens is the patient goes in to see their doctor, and the doctor says, I've got good news for you and I got bad news. The bad news is you've got a lot of calcium in your coronaries. The good news is we can do your heart catheterization tomorrow. And I see patients every week that have been abused by having a calcium scan, and then they go on and have a procedure that they didn't need. They may get a complication from the procedure. So I just don't think it's good medicine. I don't order these tests. Now, is it a good predictor of risk? Yes. Do we really need it? No. And the authors of the guidelines will say, well, look, if the calcium score is 0, then the risk is low, and therefore we can avoid treating that patient. But in the meantime, we've given them a radiation burden. I just don't think we need it to make decisions.
We have a very close friend who, according to all standard risk assessments, is doing great. I mean, his lipids look good. He exercises regularly. His diet is fantastic. He doesn't smoke. I mean, he follows all of your recommendations for a healthy lifestyle. And yet he did get talked into a calcium scan, and it did show moderate risk. And now he's candidly very concerned. It has affected him psychologically. He wanted us to help him make some decisions. You know, what should I be taking in the way of pharmaceuticals? What other procedures do I need to go in and have my cardiologist start talking about interventions? What would you advise?
Well, I don't know what his score is. I don't know, I would want to know his age and, and all the other factors involved here. But that's the problem that I'm identifying with you, is that the calcium scan can be confusing. It doesn't always clarify the situation. As you age, you develop calcium in your coronaries. And I'm going to tell you something really important about calcium that a lot of people don't know. It's actually work we've done. If you have a lot of plaque in your coronaries, and nobody knows you do, of course, but when you get put on statins, what happens is that soft cholesterol-laden plaque gets replaced with calcium. And as you treat with statins, the calcium score actually goes up. And it no longer is accurately reflecting your risk. And so the problem with it is it can be confounded if you've had your cholesterol treated previously. A lot of people don't know that. So I would rather not put people in the position of having a calcium scan. I really don't like this. I call it a cult. I think it's being done far too often. And I wasn't happy with the guideline writers for making the case that it should be done as a risk modifier or a risk enhancer, because I just think it's too tempting to people to use it as an excuse for doing unneeded catheterization, stress testing, and other sorts of things. I can't give your friend advice without knowing a lot more about the situation, but I face this kind of problem every week.
You are listening to Dr. Steve Nissen, chairman of the Robert and Suzanne Tomsich Department of Cardiovascular Medicine at the Cleveland Clinic. He co-authored with Dr. Mark Gillenoff, Heart 411, the only guide to heart health you'll ever need.
Now, have you ever had a calcium scan? Did it change your preventive strategy? We're interested in your experience, whether you're a patient or a physician. Please share your story or ask a question. Our lines are open at 888-472-3366. You can send us an email, radio@peoplespharmacy.com. That number again, 888-472-3366, Terry. And I found Dr. Nissen's remarks and research extraordinary. The idea that statins could actually increase your calcium score on a calcium scan. I wonder how many doctors and patients know that.
Certainly it was something we did not know
And
before.
we have a link to that study on our website.
Exactly right. There is a link to the study.
With today's show.
Now, we have an email from Bob in Bluffton, South Carolina, Joe. Bob says, and I think he speaks for quite a few listeners, he says it's hard to accept cholesterol as being a major risk factor. Consider the following. My mother had cholesterol levels of 292. She lived to be 92, and she had no heart issues. All my grandparents ate foods that are not recommended these days, whole milk, bacon fat, lunch meats, etc. No one ever had heart issues. Of course, they all worked hard outside every day. Two of my friends were very careful about their diets. One never ate meat, and both exercised vigorously several times a week. One had a major heart attack in his 50s, and the other died in his 50s from heart problems. And my primary care doctor indicated that 50% of his heart patients have normal cholesterol levels. Now, aside from the last observation, the rest of it, of course, is anecdotal.
Right. You can never make any conclusions based on an N of 1 or 2 or even half a dozen.
And there is evidence that high cholesterol is correlated with a higher risk of heart problems. But what we don't know, Joe, is it the cholesterol itself that's the problem, or is cholesterol a marker for something else?
Well, that is a question. Let's go to the phones, Terry. Line 2, Fash in Dallas. What is your question, please?
Yes, hello. I had a question because my friend just came back from Colombia and was telling me how much cheaper the medicine is there. And he said he bought some Z-Packs over there for like $4 versus $100 that they sell them here. And I was wondering if the ingredients or the active ingredients are the same. Is there a significant difference between what we pay so much for in the States and so little for outside the country?
What a good question, Fash. The trouble is that in some other places, I don't know about Colombia, but some other places, it is much, much easier for counterfeiters to get their medicine into the drug supply chain.
Now, just speaking about cholesterol-lowering drugs, and in particular statins, they have become incredibly affordable because most of the major ones, like Lipitor, are now available generically as atorvastatin. Of course, rosuvastatin is now available instead of Crestor. The brand names are still way, way pricey, but the generic drugs, not so much.
And most of those generic drugs, many of them, have actually been made someplace else and brought here.
Well, that's a whole other issue.
It is. We don't have time for that right now. I do want to say one other thing that's just slightly off topic, Fash, and that is Z-Pak. You couldn't buy it over the counter here, and it shouldn't be available over the counter in Colombia, although apparently it is.
If you'd like to join the conversation, our lines are open. 888-472-3366 is the number to call. You can email us. It's radio@peoplespharmacy.com. You can reach us via Twitter @peoplespharmacy. Again, that phone number, if you've had experience with statins, if you have changed your lifestyle, we'd like to hear how you've done it. If you're a cardiologist, give us a call. 888-472-3366.
And Joe, we have an email from Joseph who says, I used a statin for a few years and was having trouble remembering words when I was talking. After I talked to my doctor, I stopped the statin, and over the next months and years, my memory has improved.
You know, this is highly controversial, Terry.
It is.
We heard about this 15 or 20 years ago when we talked to Dr. Beatrice Golum out at University of California, San Diego. There haven't been great studies, but we've heard an awful lot of anecdotes where some people say, yeah, I've got a word problem. Remember the woman who said that she was asking somebody to please pass the salt, and what it came out as?
The elephant.
Yeah, please pass the elephant, which would be a little bit hard to do.
What I think is very important is that Joseph did talk to his doctor before he stopped the statin.
Absolutely. Shall we go to...
Let's go to Kristen.
Hi, Kristen.
Hello. Good morning. Hello.
Nice to talk to you.
Yes, I am almost 77. I'm 5'7". I weigh about 105 pounds because I exercise so much. I bicycle at least 100 miles a week, maybe more. I used to take cholesterol drugs. I took simvastatin, but I had such muscle cramps. My doctor said, well, you really don't need them. She said, your exercise is good, your lifestyle is good, I don't smoke, blah, blah, blah. But now I'm feeling, and listening to this program, that maybe I do need to take a cholesterol drug again because of my age. I have aged. I've been biking for many years, but now I feel like I'm slowed down some, but it concerns me.
Okay, Kristen, so you live in Florida, right? So you are still biking all year round.
Yes, but I go back to Vermont in the summer.
Oh, okay. Well,
I bike year round. Yes.
Let me just explain that what Dr. Nissen was saying is that the previous guidelines didn't have any recommendations for people over 75 because they didn't have any data that statins would or wouldn't help anybody over 75. The current guidelines say that if someone is at high risk and would therefore benefit from a statin, and if they have otherwise at least a 10-year life expectancy, that they could benefit from a statin. But if you don't have other risk factors that would put you at risk for a heart attack, it's really not something that you would necessarily need. It's something really you and your doctor need to talk about and say, what's my family history? What are my other risk factors?
Well, here's the thing that drove me crazy, and I think Dr. Nissen was concerned too, and that was people were told they needed to take a statin when they reached a certain age, regardless of their other risk factors. So if you were a man over the age of 64, it didn't matter if you rode a bike 50 miles a day. It didn't matter if you were a vegan. It just said, take a statin. You've reached 64. For women, I think it was around 70. You sound to be having a great lifestyle. If you don't have other risk factors, if you're not smoking, and clearly you are not, you may not need a statin. And as Terry says, have a chat with your doctor.
Sure, I'll have my cholesterol level checked again. I'm getting a new doctor this in the next month or so. So I will definitely bring this up with her.
This is absolutely a great conversation to have with your new doctor.
Thank you so much for the call. We really appreciate it. And I suspect, Terry, that a lot of people have similar questions. I have an email from Tony, also from Florida. He says, to placate my doctor, I take red yeast rice with phytosterols. I'm not sure what to believe anymore about what doctors say about cholesterol. I've read that more than 50% of the people who have heart attacks don't have a cholesterol problem, and doctors just don't like to talk about that aspect. Some doctors claim it's the omega-6 oils that cause all the problems. A former internist of mine recommended the red yeast rice to me instead of the statins. He was amazed when it dropped my cholesterol from 239 down to 171. In addition, I take fish oil capsules to get more omega-3s into my system, and that's a bit controversial.
A little bit, although there is research from pharmaceutical fish oil called Vascepa that shows that it can be helpful. Well, what ways are you using to lower your risk of heart disease? Have you been able to lower your LDL cholesterol and your triglycerides and raise your HDL cholesterol? Share your story with us, 888-472-3366. You can also email us, radio@peoplespharmacy.com.
You know, Terry, the one thing that fish oil really does, and does amazingly well, is it lowers triglycerides. And, you know, that's something that hasn't always gotten as much attention as it should have. You know, we pay a lot of attention to total cholesterol and LDL cholesterol.
Triglycerides are an independent risk factor for heart disease.
There are two ways to get your triglycerides down below 100.
Well, one is to stop eating processed foods because the highly processed starches and sugars raise triglycerides quite a bit.
Yeah, and fish oil does work, which is why we have drugs, actually, as you say. Vascepa is a pharmaceutical.
And Lovesa also, I think.
And they are advertised on television. So it's kind of an interesting idea here that you can actually buy prescription fish oil if your triglycerides are really high, and it will bring them down, especially if you get your diet under control.
And that part's important, too.
And you exercise. Well, we are going to come on a break. So if you've got a question or if you've got an email, just send it along. We're talking about risks and benefits of various treatments.
What's the difference between absolute risk and relative risk?
You know, how many times have we talked about that?
We're going to talk about it again.
With Dr. Steve Nissen. How do you assess your own risk of having a heart attack?
What role does inflammation play in heart disease?
And how would you even know if you had inflammation? Dr. Nissen referred to something called C-reactive protein. Have you had yours measured? Our lines are open at 888-472-3366. If you can't get through because they're busy, you can email us, radio@peoplespharmacy.com, or via Twitter. We're at People's Pharmacy.
You're listening to the People's Pharmacy with Joe and Terry Graydon. If you're enjoying this People's Pharmacy podcast, why not head over to our website? Well, you'll find a wealth of information on medications, conditions, home remedies, and ways to keep yourself healthy. You'll find it all at peoplespharmacy.com.
Welcome back to the People's Pharmacy. I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. If you would like to purchase a CD of this show, you can call 800-732-2334. It's show number 1147. Or you can also find it online at peoplespharmacy.com.
The People's Pharmacy is brought to you in part by Kaya Biotics, probiotic products made in Germany from hypoallergenic organic ingredients. That's Kaya Biotics.com.
Today we're discussing the pros and cons of statins. and other ways you can reduce your risk of developing heart disease, our country's #1 killer.
What are your strategies for keeping your heart and blood vessels in good shape? Has diet made a difference for you? If so, tell us your story. What about statins? Have they worked well? Did you have any side effects? Our lines are open at 888-472-3366. If you can't get through, you can email us, radio@peoplespharmacy.com.
We turn again to Dr. Steve Nissen, chairman of the Robert and Suzanne Tomsich Department of Cardiovascular Medicine at the Cleveland Clinic. His book is Heart 411.
Dr. Nissen, people have a terrible time analyzing risk and benefit. And so when they think about statins and they hear, atorvastatin lowered the risk of having a heart attack by about 36% over 5 years, they go, that's great. That means out of 100 people, a third didn't have a heart attack if they took medicine. Pretty good odds. Yeah, maybe two-thirds didn't, but a third got benefit. But that's not actually what happened, is it?
That's not exactly. That's exactly not what happened. Look, let's think about how you can help people to understand this. Okay, so if you take somebody whose risk is 1%, and you lower their risk by a third, it goes from 1%. That's 1 out of 100 to 0.66%. That's a very small benefit. And that's why in the discussion I emphasize that the higher the risk, the more the priority to treat. Now you give me somebody who's got a 25% risk over the next few years of having an event, and you lower their risk by a third. That's a big deal. And so I explain that to people really, really carefully. I tell them what I think their risk is. I don't tend to use the AHA-ACC risk calculator. I use something called the Reynolds risk score, which was developed by some very thoughtful people that, for example, believe it or not, the ACC-AHA guideline risk calculator does not include family history. And if you talk to any physician who's been around for any length of time, you see patients where they come in and they say, look, every man and woman in my family has had a heart attack or bypass or something bad happen, in their 40s and 50s. Those patients, no matter what the risk score looks like, are high risk because genetics are really important here. And what I like about the guidelines is they tell you now finally to consider those other factors in making a decision. And that's why a formulaic approach using a risk calculator is always a risky business.
Dr. Steve Nissen, thank you so much for talking with us on the People's Pharmacy today.
It's always great to talk to you.
You've been listening to Dr. Steve Nissen, chairman of the Robert and Suzanne Tomsich Department of Cardiovascular Medicine at the Cleveland Clinic's Seidel and Arnold Miller Family Heart and Vascular Institute. He co-authored with Dr. Mark Gillenoff, Heart 411, the only guide to heart health you'll ever need.
And Terry, this whole issue of absolute versus relative risk is so confusing. I think not just to patients. I think sometimes health professionals have a hard time understanding it because when it comes to atorvastatin Lipitor, that 36% relative reduction turns out to be, going from 3 people.
It's roughly 1 in 100 over 5 years.
Exactly, which doesn't sound quite as great as 36%. Let's go back to the phones. Where to?
Let's talk to Bill in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. Bill, welcome to the People's Pharmacy.
Thank you, Terry and Jeff. I've been listening to your show for many, many years. It's a fantastic health resource.
Thank you. What's up?
Well, I'm looking for alternatives to statins. I'm statin intolerant. It makes me feel like crap. My mom and dad both died in their late 80s. And I died of a heart attack on my 61st birthday. My pregnant wife, that's right, I'm 63. I died at 61 with a kid, my first children. I died of a heart attack on the couch and had my left ascending artery was completely blocked. I live on a farm, have an incredibly healthy lifestyle, grow my own food. And I hear there's some alternatives to statins that are not in the mainstream in terms of the pharmaceutical solutions.
Bill, you said you died.
But
I did.
You're not dead now.
Well, I'm definitely not dead. I run 2 companies, have 2 boys, have 2 farms. I better not be dead. And I woke up in UNC Hospital a few days later. The Orange Grove Volunteer Fire Department saved me with 4 electrical shocks, cracked my rib. I'm the only person they've ever saved in 25 years.
Wow.
And then they chilled me down. I'm a documentary film producer, so once I've made films about cryonics, cryobiology, so my wife got a kick out of the fact that they were about to cool me down and lower my temperature. She said, well, if he wakes up, he'll enjoy this.
Well, that is an amazing story, and we are delighted that you are alive and with us, as I know your family is as well. There are alternatives to statins, and we do hear occasionally when people say, the muscle pain was unbearable, and I just couldn't tolerate it. And so what about the 2 new drugs, relatively speaking, that offer an alternative, Terry?
There are a couple of new drugs. They're I think, indicated primarily for use as an add-on to statins, but some doctors are prescribing them to people like you who can't take statins and who are at high risk. You are clearly, having died of a heart attack once, at high risk. So these new drugs are called PCSK9 inhibitors. Their names are evolocumab, which is Repatha, and alirocumab, which is Praluent. And these are injectable medicines. You inject them yourself, I think, usually once a month. Some people prefer to do it every other week. And they do lower cholesterol beautifully. They kind of modestly reduce the risk of having another heart attack.
But it's something definitely worth discussing with your physician next time you go in. And hopefully, between your lifestyle and one of these medications, you will have many, many more healthy years ahead.
Well, I've tried Repatha, and I don't know if it was the time of year, but I was sick for about a month.
Oh, dear.
Uh-huh.
Well, you might want to ask about Praluent and see if that's any different.
Yeah, I've got to find something other than, I take my apple cider vinegar, I eat my fresh greens all the time.
Are you also taking psyllium, for example?
No. What is it?
It's very simple. It's soluble fiber. It's spelled P-S-Y-L-L-I-U-M. It's the primary ingredient in Metamucil, for example, and a few other laxatives. And what it does is it kind of absorbs the extra cholesterol and washes it out of your system, as it were. It certainly is not as effective as a statin in lowering cholesterol, but it can be helpful.
And there are other medications as well. So if you can't tolerate one of the new injectable drugs, there may be one of the older-fashioned ones that will work.
Ezetimibe is sometimes used and doesn't seem to always cause the same side effects as a statin.
Thank you so much for your call, Bill. We appreciate it. Terry, speaking of Repatha, here's an email from John. I've been plagued with high cholesterol most of my life. Doctors put me on statins, and the result was terrible pain and loss of short-term memory, among other things. The statins did lower my cholesterol from the 300s down into the 200s, but the side effects were totally unacceptable. They tried switching statins and lowering the dosages, but the results were the same. My new doctor prescribed Repatha, that's spelled R-A-P-A-T-H-A, and within 6 weeks, my cholesterol dropped to 107 with no side effects. I've been on Repatha now for 6 months and can't say enough about the new treatment.
And, Joe, we have an email from Randall who says, are the prescription fish oils better than OTC fish oil? And if so, why? Well, they are. And the reason is that they're more concentrated.
And more purified. So a lot depends on which over-the-counter fish oil you're buying, but there have been some questions about some of the cheaper brands. Where do we go next, Terry?
We're going to Hillsborough, North Carolina. Alicia, tell us your story, please.
You need to push the button, dear.
I thought I did.
Oh, there you are. Hi, Alicia.
Hello. I wanted to tell you that I am an example of using psyllium to get my cholesterol back into normal levels.
Great. Tell us more.
So I follow the unconventional HFLC, high-fat, low-carb diet to lose weight, which effectively it did, but my cholesterol went up. And one day I was in O'Hare Airport for a layover, and I started talking to a dietitian who was sitting next to me, telling her about my problem and that I didn't want to go on statins. And she says, "Oh, you need to try psyllium." And I said, "What is this?" And she explained that I just needed to take either the tablets or the fiber that you mix in a glass with some water once or twice a day, and my cholesterol would go down because cholesterol is a part of the stool from the bile. So the bile and the cholesterol bind together and you excrete it. So I went home and I tried it, and my doctor had my follow-up lab results, and my cholesterol had come back into normal levels, and I felt great and didn't have any side effects at all except regularity.
Which is not a bad side effect to have. Alicia, thank you so much for sharing that story with us. Joe, we talked to someone the other day who said he has familial high cholesterol and that he uses psyllium to keep his cholesterol under control, and it's working for him. Excellent.
Let's go to Bob in Carmine, Texas. Hi, Bob. You're on the People's Pharmacy. What's up?
Hi. I've been a listener to your program for every week that I can. I love it. And I've also been a reader in the old Houston Chronicle when Joe was by himself. So,
that goes way back.
That goes way back. But I have a question about, I understand that our brain is over 70% cholesterol, and it makes me wonder why we would want to take a cholesterol-lowering drug.
Well, Bob, a lot of people do take statins to lower their cholesterol, and it does not affect their brain function. But there are people who do notice a problem. For example, we've got an email here from Ken who says, "I'm a very active 78-year-old man. My total cholesterol 270, my HDL 80, my LDL 160. That's all too high. So I went on a statin, and within 9 weeks, those numbers all looked much better. But I had a major issue with brain fog. For example, I wouldn't see cars that were approaching an intersection. This is pretty dangerous.
Scary.
So I went to a lower dose. That didn't change. And I finally, with my doctor's knowledge, stopped taking it and have been very mentally alert since. I won't take a statin again."
Well, I think the question is important, and we do have to acknowledge that the cholesterol theory of heart disease remains contentious. Most cardiologists believe that LDL cholesterol in particular is the main culprit behind heart disease. So that's part of the reason, Bob. But lipidologist Robert Dubroff of the University of New Mexico has written a provocative commentary in the American Journal of Medicine titled "A Reappraisal of the Lipid Hypothesis." Here's just one little section that Dr. Robert Dubroff, a cardiologist, writes about. He says, LDL cholesterol is unquestionably the primary constituent of atherosclerotic plaque. Therefore, it stands to reason that lowering LDL cholesterol should prevent cardiovascular disease. 3 decades of randomized controlled trials, however, have yielded inconsistent and contradictory results. We must acknowledge these anomalies and either modify or reject the lipid hypothesis. Clearly, some individuals do benefit from lipid-modifying therapy. I believe the real question is how to identify them. We have a link to Dr. Dubroff's article on our website for today's show.
And of course, Joe, it is important to be able to identify who's going to benefit from a statin or other medication. It's very difficult. We have an email from Judy in Chapel Hill who gives us a great example of how lifestyle can change cholesterol. She says in 2017, my good HDL cholesterol was 108, which is actually very high. My LDL, and that's very good to have high HDL. My LDL was 100 and my triglycerides were 59. In 2018, my HDL went up to 144. My LDL came down to 57. My triglycerides were lower to 39. And she says, I attribute the HDL, heart protective cholesterol increase, to commuting to work and other places on foot, about 3.5 miles a day. Chapel Hill has a lot of hills. And she says the lowering of the LDL might be due to one of the Indian herbs I started taking in 2016, ashwagandha and triphala. I also eat a mostly vegan diet, and I cut out dairy a few months ago.
We have time for one last call. Let's go to Rick in Tampa, Florida. Rick, we have just under a minute. What's your story?
Hi. I guess what I wanted you guys to touch on was the importance of stress, the whole cardiovascular health issue. Because bottom line for me, my blood pressure was usually 130s over 80s. Went to Europe on a very nice, relaxing trip, came back, went to the doctors because of a flu illness, and my blood pressure reading was like 120 over 75. I said, that must be wrong. Check me again. No, it's correct. And so, quite frankly, I just wanted you guys to touch on the incredible importance of managing stress in terms of cardiovascular health, even though your show today is on lipids.
Well, your point is extremely well taken. I remember many years ago we talked to, was it Dr. Redford Williams, who wrote a book called
Anger Kills.
And the idea that hostility was a risk factor for heart disease. And I often thought, well, why don't doctors prescribe stress management and anger management?
Well, why don't they? Perhaps for the same reason they rarely prescribe exercise. It's a little harder to prescribe than a drug, and it may be a little harder for people to follow through on. But it is unquestionable, Rick, that stress is a risk factor for heart disease, and finding ways to reduce your stress are really important.
Well, that's all the time we have. Thank you so much for listening and calling in your stories. You can send us email at radio@peoplespharmacy.com or leave a message at 888-472-3366.
Lynn Siegel produced today's show. Pamela Alberta provided technical assistance, and Jenny was the engineer today with Al's help.
The People's Pharmacy is produced at the studios of North Carolina Public Radio, WUNC.
The People's Pharmacy theme music is by B.J. Liederman.
To order today's show, you can call 800-732-2334. Today's show is 1147. That number again, 800-732-2334. You can find it at peoplespharmacy.com. When you're there, you can tell us what you think about the show, and you'll find links to the new guidelines that Dr. Nissen talked about and Dr. Robert Dubroff's article.
You can also sign up for our free online newsletter or subscribe to the free podcast of the show. When you sign up for the newsletter, you'll get our free e-guide to favorite home remedies. If you listen to the podcast, please think about writing a review.
In Durham, North Carolina, I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. Thanks for listening. Please join us again next week.
We hope you enjoyed this podcast. If so, please consider taking a minute to write a review on iTunes. And thanks for listening to The People's Pharmacy.